Eric Johnson is one of the foremost experts in internet policy, cyber defense, and democracy promotion in developing nations. Eric has been involved in numerous NGOs since the advent of the internet. Eric is fluent in Russian and also has a computer science background. He has been very instrumental in helping developing nations promote internet news and has assisted these nations by implementing policies to ensure that journalists and those involved with news can freely exercise their right to provide news to the people of their respective countries. All right, welcome to the Mastercation of Edubation Podcast. I have with me Eric Johnson. How are you today, Eric?
Pretty good.
Good. Let's start with this. How did you get involved in journalism?
Well, strictly speaking, I'm not a journalist. Are you okay? You have my video and stuff, everything you need?
Yeah, I got you. It looks like the video froze. I see you. It's just I don't see any motion on it.
Try again to get that going. Strictly speaking, I'm not a journalist. I'm an aid worker, and I got into journalism sort of sideways because I finished studying Russian studies just when the Soviet Union fell, and so I was looking for something to do, and I stumbled upon these folks doing citizen diplomacy, and they said, "Well, let's go. We have some friends in the Russian media. Let's go talk to them." So we talked to them, and they came up with some ideas, and just then, the U.S. government and the European governments are thinking, well, the USSR is falling apart. Let's see what we can do to help them convert to be like us. We want them to be good Democrats and capitalists. So let's come up with a plan. After all, after World War II, it worked, right, with the whole Marshall Plan thing. So let's do something like that. So essentially, both the U.S. and Europe, a little bit more slowly, started allocating fairly serious money toward aid. And very roughly, it doesn't sound like a lot maybe now, but 30 years ago, $1 billion a year was a pretty good sized chunk of aid. Mm-hmm. I think in the U.S. it was originally called the Freedom Support Act, and the result was that a whole bunch of money was available to do aid work in the post-communist countries, and the bureaucracies that administer that aid don't really know much about the post-communist world because they couldn't, because nobody ever had, and so all of a sudden money was available and there wasn't a lot of understanding of what to do. So when these citizen diplomacy type folks and I rocked up and knocked on their door and asked for what we thought was a really big grant of I think we asked for $200,000 because that seemed like a lot of money to us. And they laughed and they said, "We cannot spend money in such small bits because we have to spend $1 billion. Help us out here." And I'm like, okay, so, at that point I was sort of like, I just joined, and so I wasn't doing the negotiations with USAID, but the upshot was that our group basically said, well, what about $1 million? And USAID said, well, that's still kind of small. And we said, well, what about $3 million? And they said, okay. So that was the beginning of a fairly serious period of aid spending, and the group I was with was a bunch of journalists. So they said, what we should do is go out and support independent journalism in these new countries, right? There are all these people who are starting to do journalism, or they're doing new journalism, but there's been no tradition of real journalism. So let's go help them. So we did a huge amount of training of journalists and training of television station managers and training of advertisement salespersons and training of media lawyers and training of everybody who has anything to do with media. And then everything else we could think of. We gave away a lot of equipment, and we acquired programming, and we set up national networks, and we set up associations of journalists and of broadcasters and of publishers. And so that was my sort of backdoor into journalism. I'm still not a journalist. I've never been a journalist, but I've spent, I don't know, 10, 20, 30, 50, $100 million of money on supporting independent journalism in developing countries.
Now, when these journalists were being set up and established, this was were these for Russian journalists that were, looking that the American government was looking to have promote democracy and capitalism in Russia?
Not really. The idea was to support journalism. It wasn't to promote democracy and capitalism. It was just the basic assumption underlying thought was freedom of access to information and freedom of expression is a keystone element of all the things that we hold dear, and it's sort of pretty easy to define and pretty easy to go out and do compared to, let's say, justice, which is another keystone element, right? Well, how are you going to reform all these courts and all these old judges and all these criminal justice systems and all these law enforcement agencies and all these police and all this? I mean, how do you? It's just almost beyond comprehension to think of how much work there is to do on justice.
Right.
And then education is going to be another big one, and maybe the stock market or regulation of financial institutions and commodities and securities is going to be another big one. But media or freedom of access to information, what I was doing, it was just a whole lot easier. I just stumbled into something that it was really easy to describe. To say, if we can just get a bunch of budding journalists in a room and teach them how to. I mean, what does it take to make a good news story, right? You need to have a couple of points of view, and they're like, oh, wow. We're like, and so then, I mean, all it takes is, let's just say 10 things, more or less, to produce a good news story. I mean, it takes skill, and it takes knowledge, and it takes experience, and it takes contacts, but in terms of describing what it takes, it's not rocket science. I'm not going to have to teach you to all of what goes into, a cyber secure website or something, which is just a whole lot more complicated. And we found it easy to describe these things to donors, and we found it, certainly not trivial to do, but possible. And so we would set up an office in each of the post-Soviet countries, and then we'd hire local staff, and then we'd set about doing this whole battery of things.
Now, are these mostly NGOs, non-government organizations that are, helping to promote journalism, and who was mostly the sponsoring them?
Well, the work was done by my colleagues and me. So we were an NGO. And we kind of replicated ourselves as we went, because we found that there were lots of reasons why just being one NGO from being an American NGO was maybe suboptimal. And so we set up a representative office in country X, and then we realized that we would be more trustworthy and we could do things better and differently if we were a local NGO. So we would set up a local NGO. And so the folks we were trying to help were not nonprofits; they were for-profits. Right? They were commercial media. So, think of CNN or think of ABC or CBS or NBC or whatever, whatever medium you think of. But it's about news, right? All we cared about was news. So if a TV station was running just movies, we'd be like, yeah, that's fine. You go do that. That has nothing to do with us. But anything that was news, we cared about. So we did a little bit of print journalism and some radio journalism, but the vast majority of the way that people got information there and then was television. So it was mostly television.
How did you end up getting involved with InterNews International?
Well, so there was this one NGO, this American NGO, InterNews, which was like 3 or 4 people when I stumbled upon it because I had just finished my degree, and I wrote to everybody I could think of. This was in 1991, so we didn't really have the internet, but I did a bunch of research to figure out anybody who had ever had anything to do with the Russian-speaking world, and I wrote to them all. It was like 400 letters. And one of them fell upon this small group of folks who had done this thing a few years earlier called Capital to Capital, which was where they connected up via satellite the Russian, Soviet, and American parliaments, and then they made a TV show out of it. So as a result, they had a bunch of connections in the Russian media. And so now fast forward back to the present 1991, and they're like, oh, we should get in touch with our old buddies that we did this satellite, parliament to parliament thing with. But they don't speak Russian. So that was where my letter just fell on their desk at the right moment. They're like, oh, Eric, help us out, do some translation, go over and visit them and help us design some projects. So off that went. And so then we're like, we get this big grant from USAID. We create this office in Moscow to start doing the work. And then pretty soon, Kazakhstan is like, oh, we're a separate country. So then we create a separate office in Kazakhstan. And then Ukraine says the same thing, and so on and so forth. So then it's country after country. And then, like I said, over time, it became clear that it would be smarter if we had independent local NGOs. So in each one of those countries, we would convert our rep office of the American NGO into a local NGO. We'd corral our closest friends and colleagues and confidants in that country, and we'd say, you really need to create an NGO. And they'd say, and what? And we'd be like, a nonprofit. And they're like, a non what? and we'd say, well, it works like this. And they'd say, yeah, but we don't have a law for that. And we'd say, well, okay, let's see if we can fix that. So we'd help them get a nonprofit law passed. I mean, there were other people thinking about the same thing at the same time. And then we'd under this new NGO law or whatever kind of law there was, we would register a local NGO. So then we had all of these separate legal entities, right? So there was a Kazakhstani one called InterNews Kazakhstan. And there was one in Tajikistan called Piro, meaning pen, meaning freedom of expression, right? And then after we kind of start replicating ourselves, and there's lots of little InterNewses out there, we're like, well, we should, we probably need to we're kind of splintering, so we need to somehow regroup. And so then we created a new NGO in Paris, which we called InterNews International, and it was the association of all of the InterNewses. And because I had been kind of out there as the foot soldier setting up these little local InterNewses, they told me that I had to be the director of this association. But that makes it sound like I'm like the head of the whole thing, which I wasn't. That was just the umbrella organization that was like to make us all feel like we're one big happy family. But the heavy lifting was done by each of the individual members, and predominantly, of course, most of the money would come from the U.S., so it would come through InterNews US, or eventually it would come through European donors. So then we created another NGO, InterNews Europe, and we got all the European, because the Americans and the Europeans are both kind of funding chauvinistic, so they want to fund their own. So we realized we had to have a big NGO in each of those places to receive that funding. And then we had all those little NGOs out in the field that were doing the work, and then we united them all up into this sort of mega thing, InterNews International. And we ended up with, 25 different InterNewses at various points. And sometimes they would come and go depending on funding and personality and possibilities. And so let's say the Uzbekistan one was great for a while, and then after a while Uzbekistan became ever more dictatorial, and eventually they closed us out. So that was the end of InterNews Uzbekistan, and so on and so forth.
So are they loosely affiliated, most of the different InterNews organizations, or was there a lot of oversight?
Well, the long-term goal became, of course, the long-term goal was for every country to have a vibrant and financially sustainable local independent news scene. But we felt it was important for each one of those countries to have financing to help that happen, and therefore it was important to have this local NGO doing that work. And so we would sort of spawn or give birth to this local NGO, and then as long as we could continue to get funding from the big donors in the West and channel it through our Washington and Paris offices to Almaty or to Dushanbe or Baku or wherever, then we would keep doing that. And we would encourage that local NGO, and we would try to train it up and skill it and capability it so that it would start doing fundraising on its own. Now, the big donors, the European and the US donors, they were not usually likely to give money to a local NGO because they wouldn't trust it, because they would assume that there was fraud going on or it wasn't going to do the right thing. So they always wanted to give money to the big NGOs, the Western ones. And we're fine. From our point of view, we're like, you want to give money to an American NGO? We can do that. We'll just, pass it on to our local NGOs out there. And because they're our friends, and we put in place systems for control and compliance and reporting and finances and accounting and taxes and insurance and all that stuff, we could be confident that stuff would happen well. And usually we would have like one foreigner in each country, and then maybe 10, 15, 25, 30, up to 100 local staff doing the work. And the idea would be that over time there would be less and less need for expensive foreign oversight and more local capability to just do what needs to be done themselves. And that's kind of how it's worked out. Now, it's had varying levels of success in the sense of some of those local InterNewses are more successful than others, but it depends as much on funding availability as it does anything else, and of course a lot on personality. So if you can find some, really talented person to take over that local InterNews and become its director, and to, be willing to stand up to government repression and to be playing the media game that always needs to be played and to be trusted by the donors, well, that would be more successful than the lack of those things. But InterNews Ukraine is still quite powerful. InterNews Armenia is still going quite strong. InterNews Russia was at one time one of the 3 or 4 biggest NGOs in the country until Putin decided that, he didn't really want independent media. And so he started figuring out how to shut us down, and eventually he did. And when the time came, we kind of knew that it was going to be time to go, because you can fight, but you're just going to hurt yourself more the longer you fight. So,
how did you initially get into the Russian language and history?
Well, I'm a probably moderately typical progeny of American intellectuals, not only, but mom was a professor. Dad did his doctorate work in forestry, decided to go into agriculture. So they bought a farm in Iowa, and I grew up on that farm driving tractors and milking cows. So maybe not entirely typical, but nonetheless, still, the kinds of parents who would go to small liberal arts colleges. Both parents were Peace Corps volunteers in their day. And so when the time comes to, grow up and go to school and go to college, you should, by definition, learn a foreign language. And at that point in the early 80s, French and German and Spanish are the obvious ones, but they're boring. So if you're more adventurous, you're going to learn Chinese or Japanese or Russian, and you kind of flip a coin among them. If you want to go into, if you're interested in business, then you'll do Japanese, and if you're interested, at that point, China we didn't know much about, and Russia was the enemy. So I'm like, well, that sounds really interesting. I'll do Russia. So I learned Russian in college, and that was my door in.
How was it? Was it hard for you to learn like different the Cyrillic alphabet?
No, I mean, everything is relative, right? So I studied Spanish in high school, and so of course learning Russian was harder than that because you have different alphabet. But then fast forward a couple decades, and I'm learning Chinese, and I'm like, wow, Russian sure was easy compared to this. The Cyrillic alphabet, I mean, it's basically kind of just, any alphabetical language tends to be relatively easy just because it's more or less one-to-one to what we're used to, right? A B is a B is a B. Okay, it's written differently, but that's not that hard to memorize, right? I mean, and Russian is not the hardest language in the world. I rather enjoyed it because it's the way it's written and spoken is very much built out of building blocks. So it's a lot more logical than English and French and our other sort of like Romance languages. Because if you learn the basic 100 or 200 roots, and then a bunch of prefixes, and then a bunch of suffixes for your verb declensions and your noun conjugations and so on, vice versa, then you kind of more or less can. You fit these pieces together, and it makes a lot of sense. It's kind of beautiful. Yeah, I can go read, Pushkin or Lermontov, and if I encounter a word I don't know, I'll just split it up into little pieces and figure it out. It's a little bit like German, like that, I guess.
How long would you say it would take someone that's dedicated to become fluent in speaking Russian?
Oh, I would say if you study it full time, a year, no more.
And did you have other people to speak Russian with when you were learning?
Well, in college, there are other students who are learning, and as an early student, you're an early student like you're an early student of anything else. So you're not that serious about it because who knows whether this is ever going to be useful. It's just a course, but then there are usually going to be, in any good school, there are going to be native Russian speakers around because they're going to be your professors. They might have a Russian language assistant or something. So that's going to help you. And then of course the holy grail for any language is that you go live there. So that was my goal at these little liberal arts schools like the ones that I went to, and my kids and my parents. Then they have lots and lots of opportunities for studying abroad. So in the mid 80s, it wasn't that easy to get into Russia, but it was possible. So if you tried hard enough and did the necessary, then you could, and I did. So then in 87, I went and spent a semester in Moscow studying Russian notionally, but studying whatever it is that there was to study, but basically mostly just being immersed in the language. And that makes a huge difference, made a huge difference.
I was impressed earlier too when you said you wrote about 400 letters when you were looking to get involved with different organizations. I just try to think of today. It's like when I gotta go, it's a lot more easier nowadays to apply to jobs and everything being automated. But I just think of how just even how tedious that is, just trying to go through all the different applications. I couldn't.
Well, how I did it was a little different. The application forms nowadays, it's a little bit clearer what they're asking for. But at that point, I didn't have anything to apply for. So I just wrote letters. I mean, I was an early tech adopter. So, I would figure out how to do a mail merge and whatever. But I would write a letter and I'd say, "Dear so-and-so at Citibank, I hear you guys have an interest in this strange new world over there, the Russian-speaking world. And I speak Russian. So you need me. Give me a call." And, most of them would fall on deaf ears, or maybe would never find somebody, but a few of them would get responses, and it worked. What else can I say?
So what's it been like in the world of democracy promotion? Like, what are some of the more effective methods that you've seen in your experience, and what are some of the least effective methods?
Well, I'd say that there are a couple elements that make a big difference. First of all, of course, it needs to be a place it needs to be fertile soil in some sense, right? So there has to be like the more, well, so one way to look at this is there's this American NGO called Freedom House, and they do these annual scores of every country in the world of how free it is. And, that means that, the most free countries, I don't know, Sweden or something, they're going to be up in the 90s. And then the least free countries, North Korea and Syria, they're going to be down in the, 1, 2, 3 or something. And every country is in between there somewhere. And you can more or less say that a country that's under 30 is probably not going to be a good place to try to promote democracy, because the soil is just not fertile enough. You could get killed, or the people you're trying to work with will get killed. The legal environment isn't going to make things possible. Something over 60 is probably already pretty much on its way. I mean, Hungary might be 65 or something, and it's not super democratic. It's maybe one of the least democratic countries in Europe, but it's basically more or less okay. And it's a fairly advanced country. And if I try to walk in there with $1 million grant, I'm probably not going to change much, because it's a fairly advanced place. Whereas some countries in between, those are going to be the ones that are kind of the most interesting. And where you go and what you do will probably depend a lot on where the money is available for. Because there was a time when the U.S. invades Afghanistan, and then boom, there's a huge amount of money available for Afghanistan. And you can go say, well, that's going to be a really hard place to work, and I don't know how sustainable it's going to be, but there are things we can do. So, for instance, Afghanistan, in InterNews, we helped set up some 40 radio stations, and did our contribution to the extent that we could. We created a demand for news, and we helped a lot of journalists get started. And but that kind of change doesn't happen overnight in a country, and that's a hard country to work in. Ukraine, same type of thing. We did a lot of good stuff, and you could say that we were much more successful in Ukraine than in Afghanistan, even though the amounts of money spent there were not too different. Let's just say, $3 million a year for 25 years. Let's just say both of those places were places that had quite a bit of resources compared to many other places. And if you can find the right people that are dedicated to it, your local staff, and you can acquire the political pull that's going to be necessary to prevent yourself from being kicked out of the country. And you can find, sufficiently educated people to try to train and to help set up local media in a manner that somehow results in their being dedicated to the idea of news as opposed to merely making money. Well, that can work. And again, it's totally dependent on those local situations. Kyrgyzstan has done pretty good. Tajikistan, not as good, but not terrible. Belarus, a lot of educated people, a lot of interest in independent media, a lot of demand, but a government which has made it very difficult. And therefore, eventually, they ran us out of there as well. So it depends. Indonesia, I would call it a qualified success story. We did pretty good. We helped a lot of radio stations. They contributed a lot to the whole sort of like post-Suharto, more or less flowering. I mean, Indonesia is a pretty successful place on that front these days. Cambodia, maybe not so much.
When you're getting started in these countries, what's like the ideal type of citizen that you're looking for to work with when you're promoting democracy?
Well, the ideal person would be somebody who's, in terms of who you're looking to work with, there's the employees that you want. There's the people that you want to try to influence. The people you're trying to influence, you're trying to create a market for independent news. And generally that's going to be middle-aged people, because older people tend to be a little bit more set in their ways and conservative and nostalgic often. They're like, things were just fine when I was a kid, and now everything sucks, so I don't like it. Young people, the very youngest people, the 18, 22, 24-year-olds, they're usually more interested in being open-minded. They're generally always revolutionaries, right? Like you and I were back in the day. Mm-hmm. They're usually more techno-capable, and so at any given time, they're going to be the ones that are using those resources to make the connections around the world. They're interested in studying abroad. Some of them have studied abroad. They've come home. So there's sort of like a sliding scale of being open to the world and interested in new things. And also, younger people are more likely to say they're going to be supporters of democracy, whatever that means. But then older people might be like, yeah, we were really excited about democracy when it came, 20 or 30 years ago, and look how that's turned out. It sucks. So no, it's not so great. And part of the problem is that democracy, we sell democracy like it's going to be the be all and end all. Like if you just, adopted a good constitution, then you'd be just like the US, but it's not quite that easy, right?
It's funny you mentioned that, because the more I was thinking, like on a grassroots level, at least in my experience in the U.S., it doesn't really seem like we have a lot of true, active democracy. I remember like when I lived in my one neighborhood in Philadelphia, each block had the block captain in North Philadelphia, and sometimes they would try to, get together to try to start some different programs. One of them they wanted to do was painting some of just getting a grant to paint some houses, that were kind of falling apart on the one block by LaSalle University. They made a proposal to the city and were, virtually ignored. And I just really never would see like, a lot of, at least politicians very active on the grassroots level. Usually we see them more active on the business level. And, like I know in the military, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, it actually seemed like a lot of the initial efforts from the military were to try to actually involve the tribal leaders, the clan leaders. But yeah, it's funny because, at least in my experience in the U.S., we really don't have too much of that.
Well, I mean, everything's relative. I guess I get engaged in these discussions a lot, and it's easy to say, well, you democracy missionary, you're out there preaching to the world and you're trying to make everybody else into a democracy, but why don't you fix stuff at home first? Because boy, in the US it sucks. And I'm like, well, it's all just a scale, and none of us in this business are asserting that it's perfect in the US. But would you rather live in the US or would you rather live in North Korea? Oh, no, that's not what I mean. Well, but that is what we mean. That's what we're talking about here. It's all on a scale here. Would you rather live in China? Because I don't see you going to live in China, right? No. I mean, of course it's better in Europe, but it's terrible. And I'm like, yeah, but everything's relative. Like, and I mean, if I'm sitting around, trying to preach about these things, I can give all sorts of examples. In my hometown in Northeast Iowa, I think we have plenty of problems too, but I see lots of activism in the sense of, people getting like a big lumber yard and home improvement store in middle US is called Menards. It's a really, really big store. It's kind of like Lowe's or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so Menards is like, hey, Eric's hometown, we want to build here. So they move in and the local community says, basically, no, we don't want that, because where you're going to build is going to be right next to the river, and it's probably going to destroy the floodplain. And you're certainly going to knock out of business all of the local businesses that have anything to do with selling the kinds of things that you do. So no. And Menards is like, how can you say that? We're going to bring all sorts of employment and cheaper prices, and people are going to come from miles around to your town. And we're going to be like, you know what? That's what they told us when Walmart came. And we kind of bought it then, but we're not that excited about it now. So that's okay. You can, go build in the next town over, or we'll just drive 60 miles to the nearest Menards. That's okay, but we don't want you there. Is that democracy? Well, I don't know, but it's the kind of local activism that I am not sure I would expect to happen spontaneously in Kyrgyzstan or Cambodia. It's the kind of thing that, people who are used to being free and saying what they think and gathering together. I mean, de Tocqueville is the Bible in these things. I don't know if you remember that from your college political science courses, right? De Tocqueville is like, say again?
The French explorer who wrote on his venture.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, he's like, I can't believe these Americans, they get together to do anything. They have parents associations, and they have farmers associations, and they have trade guilds, and they have unions, and it's like any which way you turn, there's another bunch of people getting together to do things. I mean, and the fact that everybody now these days all over the world is so excited about their WhatsApp groups says to me that people like getting together to do things. you know, and I think that certainly is one of the things that makes the U.S. special, because I've lived all over the world and I don't see people like that. I mean, there's a certain amount of it, in Sweden and France and England and so on, but nothing like in the U.S. And I'm probably maybe romanticizing it a little bit, because it's easier for people to do those things in smaller communities than it is in a big city, right? So if you live in an apartment building in Manhattan, you're maybe a little less likely to do that kind of thing. But in rural America, this is lifeblood. This is what everybody does all the time. And it's true that the world is going urban, and now the U.S. is probably 90% urban. But on the other hand, 90% of the land is rural, and all those people out there, they're constantly doing things all the time. So I guess, the notion behind this local news horse that I've been riding my whole life, the NGO, the InterNews work, the aid, is that if we can help local news exist everywhere so that people know what's going on, and so that their governments are held accountable, then they will have the information they need to be an active participant in forming the life around themselves, their environment, and determining what they want it to look like. And if they want it to look like Putin, well, okay. I mean, that's their business.
Where do you see the future of local news going in the next few years? Do you think with just new technologies, there's different things that can change, or do you think it'll still kind of stay the same?
Well, it's already changed hugely. I mean, when I got into this business, the news business as aid in the early 90s, television was it. And then if a country was poorer, then radio was it, right? But newspapers were not a big thing in most countries back then, and they still aren't, because newsprint is so expensive and distribution is so expensive. But of course, the internet gradually came in, and everybody got connected, and that changed everything. So the entire news business is upended now, and that was pretty exciting in our business, because if you're working in a country where the airwaves are government controlled, and the printing presses are government controlled, and the forests are government controlled, well, it's going to be pretty hard to do what you want to do. Whereas when you get lots more people online and you can start reaching them directly through your various electronic means of communication, then you circumvent a lot of these difficulties. It was sort of, satellite television provided a foretaste of that. So when satellite TV started to become direct to home, satellite TV started to become available in the 90s. That was pretty exciting. We were using it in the former Soviet Union, but as a distribution mechanism to get video out to local rebroadcasters, local TV stations. But then in the 2000s, as satellite TV popped up everywhere, all of a sudden everybody could see the world out there, and that meant that they were demanding things from their governments that they otherwise wouldn't have. And the internet is just the next step in that, making it all super accessible and super well. It has a bunch of ramifications. One, it's just too damn fast. So it becomes a lot harder to do the kind of journalism that we were always proponents of, which is, thoughtful, analytical journalism. Mm-hmm. It means that misinformation, malinformation, disinformation can move awfully fast. And you know how we always say disinformation is halfway around the world before the fact checker has even started to fact check it. So That's a whole separate discussion. We can get into that in a minute. But on the other hand, it makes it possible for you to get news to people. It makes people who otherwise were not going to get news to get it. So in the same way that the unbanked can become banked, well, the uninformed can become more informed. And so there's both opportunities. And the biggest change to the news business simply has been that the revenue model has been killed, right? Because news was based before on advertising, and now all those ad dollars and pounds and yen and whatever are all going to Facebook and Google, and so the news producers are left high and dry without resources. So that's a really big challenge, and we certainly haven't gotten very close to solving it. It's great that a sufficient number of people are willing to step up and subscribe to the New York Times and Washington Post, but in the aggregate, news the way it was before is dead, and that's going to require a lot of imagination. What's the future, you asked? Part of it is more local. I think it makes with everybody being connected, it's more possible. It's easier to have local news, and so we've sort of seen a drastic decline in local news, and now it's starting to pick back up, where hyperlocal journalism is able to become sustained, serving a small community, 10, 20, 30,000 people, a neighborhood or a county. And I think there's real opportunity for that. I'm not saying it's easy, because money is still not just falling from trees. And it's possible that we'll need to figure out new revenue sources that might have to do with public funding. That's something that the Americans have always been philosophically objected to, but much of the rest of the world has basically thought that that's normal. We the Americans have objected to it partly because we say if it's government funding, then it's going to come with strings attached, and you're never going to be able to have the freedom that you want to say. But maybe it's possible to invent ways to firewall that money off. So, for instance, a couple of countries that we worked in, they now fund public interest journalism via a tax on the power bill.
Really?
And the money goes directly from, the power companies to a fund which finances local independent journalism, not through the government, right?
I've never heard of something like that. That's cool.
That's one way to do it. I mean, the UK has always been the example that everybody says we're going to follow, because the BBC is financed by a tax on TV sets, and so that kind of makes sense. If you have a TV set, you pay the tax, and then you get content for your TV set. So that's always been kind of logical, but the UK might be retreating from that model now, and maybe people depend less on television. Certainly young people, I don't know about you, but I last watched news on television in about, 99 or something. So the whole validity of some model based around a television set is certainly dying. But Australia has told Facebook and Google that you can't keep profiting off of our media's news. And Facebook and Google said, "What are you talking about? We're not cheating them. I mean, we bring traffic to them, so it should be good for them." And the Australian government said, "Nah, it's not enough. Tell you what, either you work out a revenue sharing model with the media, or we're going to block you." And Facebook and Google said, "We dare you." And you might have heard this. The first place that did this was Spain, and then Google therefore cut off all Spanish media from search results.
Really?
And that was pretty painful for Spanish media. And so Spain suffered a lot because of that, because of being a first mover there. But fast forward a few years, and Australia started doing the same thing. And eventually, the way it worked out was that Google and Facebook have struck deals with local media, and they're now revenue sharing. So, that's another model. Besides there's the public financing through something like a levy on electricity. There's that model that the Australians have, and maybe there are others. But the upshot is journalism definitely needs to figure out new ways to get financed, and we as societies, we need to recognize that news is important, and if we don't have a way to finance it, then we lose one of the foundational cornerstones of democracy.
Because otherwise, it seems like nowadays, something like Twitter's become the new town crier, town forum, and with something like that, you can get also a lot of misinformation, as anyone with a keyboard can type up a little 140-word blurb, and next thing you know, if that person had any sort of credibility, it doesn't even matter how credible, as long as they have a sizable audience, all of a sudden it's gospel. So I always thought, having good local news would be very important, because nowadays, most of the mainstream news, it just seems more narrative based, as opposed to, you still get that little bit with your local news on TV, like an eyewitness news, where you're having that on the ground reporting. But for the most part, at least to me, it seems like the more mainstream news is, it's just more narrative based than actually having your local citizens on the ground reporting legit journalism as to the facts and events that are going on in their local neighborhood.
Well, sir, there's probably a need for all these different kinds of journalism. I mean, you've got the Twitter, which I don't think of as so much journalism. I think of Twitter as a conversational space. Like you said, town hall, it's great, but a town hall is not a news source, right? Mm-hmm. A town hall is a place for people to get together and discuss things, and maybe draw conclusions and make decisions, but it's not a news source. So I don't think of Twitter as a competitor to news of any sort. It's a delivery mechanism. I'm sure that some journalists will make money by using Twitter as their delivery mechanism, and that will be a different kind of news than the kind of news that other journalists make money on when they work for the New York Times. And those might be two poles, but even the New York Times is only somewhere in the middle there, because you've got the longer form journalism over on the edge, which is like the New Yorker and Harper's and Atlantic, right? These are really good pieces, the kinds of stuff that comes out on ProPublica. And then in between, you've got the newspapers, and then you've got the really, really short form type of journalism like Twitter. But there's space for all this, and the internet makes it possible to maybe even invent new ones. I mean, who the heck knows what AR and VR is going to start doing? I would love it if I could go out and walk around. As I walk, my glasses would point out something news related about that building across the street, right?
I always thought that would be cool. I'm just worried with those glasses, people aren't going to be paying attention and walking in the traffic.
Well, then the glasses need to help us with that, right? I mean, if the glasses are smart enough, they should be able to tell me about an impending danger so that I'm safer with the glasses on than with them off.
That's a good point. So what other, going to misinformation, what methods have you been experienced with to kind of counter misinformation and disinformation?
Well, I mean, in the ideal world, people would become sort of inoculated against it. But that's certainly a worthy goal, but it's a generational type thing, right? I mean, you don't take a 40-year-old and give them a 10-minute course on how to distinguish truth from falsehood, and then bam, all of a sudden it's fixed. It's a lot harder than that, right? So I think it's critically important that we have that we teach kids how to think about this. But to be honest, I don't really think differentiating fake news from real news is a thing. I think what's a thing is just critical thinking, right? If we teach people how to think critically, then they will not be gullible for crap that comes through the airwaves. The thing that I'm most excited about when it comes to fighting disinformation is demotion. So if you go onto Facebook and you post something onto your wall or whatever we call it these days, and it's going to pop into the feeds of all of your friends, right? Or some of them. And it'll pop into the feeds of the friends who have demonstrated more of an interest in you one way or another, like maybe your closer friends. But it's not going to be very high up the feeds of others of your friends. And if you want it to be higher up in the feeds of your friends, you can pay Facebook a little bit, right? That's promotion. And that's advertising by another name, right? It's causing something to become more visible in the welter of all the stuff in front of us. Well, demotion is the opposite. And this is exactly how Facebook and Twitter deal with it right now, and Google as well, which is that they try to use whatever means available to them to detect what information on their platform is less reliable, less valid, and they demote it. I mean, everything that you see, everything that you consume these days, you probably somehow got to through an algorithm. So the key here is the algorithms. And, we complain a lot about ad tech and how those algorithms promote engagement, and engagement is most successful when it's controversial crap. And so that's not so good for the body politic. But it's also perfectly possible to design those algorithms so that the crap is further down in the feed, mm-hmm. and the higher quality stuff is higher up. And so what we need to do is get better at that. And whether that means that we need to get better at detecting it, or get better at evaluating it, or get better at incentivizing the algorithms, or the creators of the algorithms, or the purveyors of the algorithms. Well, all of the above. But most countries in the world by now have one NGO, or more than one, which has constituted itself as a fact checker. So in the US, you might have heard of Politico, for instance. But there are organizations like that everywhere in the world. And they set themselves up a few years ago when the infodemic started to become a thing, saying we're going to help solve it, right? Because when fake news or misinformation pops up, we will be there to check it and then squash it. Problem being, of course, that they do check it, and they do announce on their website and their Facebook account, and Twitter, and then everything else now that this is wrong. But who consumes that, right? Everybody consumed the misinformation. Mm-hmm. But so the question is, how can the results of these fact checkers work be operationalized somehow? And an answer I think a really powerful answer is that Facebook needs to depend on a fact checker to determine what's wrong. And then Facebook needs to take that information from the fact checkers about what's wrong and use it to demote the crap. And that is exactly how it works.
Now, with that though, like my only concern with it is sometimes I just feel like I can get a little bit politicized with determining what's legit and what's not. Like, for example, I mean, with everyone's favorite debate the last year with the COVID vaccine, it's like, all right, if someone's putting out something that there's microchips that are going to activate something in you in the next 2 years, it's like, yeah, that's something that I would say, definitely being on the more ridiculous side to get definitely put that on the bottom. But then at the same time, if someone has like a scientific argument that, all right, a natural immunity might be just as effective as the vaccine, and then that's getting pushed down, that's just usually the only concern I kind of have is how politicized some of these organizations like Facebook can get when they're determining what's legitimate news and what's not.
Let's not get too far down the rabbit hole of false equivalency, which is where we say, well, every point of view has a right to exist. I'm Tucker Carlson and I'm just asking questions. I mean, we should be able to ask questions, right? Sure. And Tucker Carlson might be an alien or might be in the pay of Putin. I'm just asking questions, right? I mean, no, it's not all the same, right? So when you say, I'm worried that somebody's going to fact check ivermectin, and they're gonna conclude that it's actually pointless in terms of treating COVID-19, but that's political. So I'm a little worried about that. No, there's nothing political about that. That's just facts, right? And vaccines are good at preventing people from dying. That's just a fact. If somebody else wants to call that political, fine, but anti-vaxxers should be demoted. And it's not about political. It's not about Repubs or Dems or Libertarians or anybody else, commies or capitalists. It's just facts. So the fact checkers don't generally try to make political judgments. They try to figure out what's true. And when they can tag something as being false, then we want that false thing to be demoted. It's just, I mean, you can divide all the stuff on Facebook into all these different piles, but some of it is definitely false. And that's what we want demoted. And that might be only 1%, but okay, that's what we're talking about demoting. We're not talking about demoting discussion and debate and arguments, free speech and question asking, but we are talking about demoting. I think this is a right way to go in terms of dealing with disinformation, is that we want our algorithms to demote crap.
How has it been, in your experience, the effectiveness of the algorithms that have been developed so far for fact checking and misinformation?
I think we're getting better at it. I mean, the way it works now is that there are these fact checking organizations around the world, and they do fact check, and the results of their fact checking do feed in to what Facebook does. And then Facebook tries to set its AI algorithms, or more precisely machine learning, on learning from the fact checkers how to do their job. They're the algorithm's job, right? Because you can't really expect a fact checker to keep up with all of the crap on the internet. So what we need to do is train our algorithms using the fact checkers' results, so that the algorithms can go out and do their job. And in theory, if we build our algorithms right, they should get smarter and smarter, and we should have less false positives and false negatives. And I mean, automating it really is the only way that this is going to work. The only alternative is to either we just let all the crap go, allow it, or we shut it all down. And neither of those seem better. In fact, they both seem worse. So the I'm not going to say the happy medium, the unhappy medium, right? The least worst of all evils is where we gradually train our algorithms to do better at demoting the crap.
What was your involvement like with the Global Internet Policy Initiative?
Well, I guess I kind of helped create it. When we got all that sort of media aid, media development, journalism training work going, first in the Russian-speaking world and then in other countries in the 90s, the general progression was first we'd be like, let's train journalists. And that was really easy to understand, right? It was easy to fundraise for. It was relatively easy to do. It was easy to find partners who we could work with on it. It was easy to define what it is that we wanted to do. And it was moderately easy to measure the output because we could measure journalists' capabilities before and after a workshop. And then we could monitor the news that they were being produced, they were producing, and we could rate it on quality scales. So that was the first few years. And then after that, it became clear that journalists were not going to be able to do what they needed to do if they weren't financed, because obviously they need to get paid. So then we realized that we need to help the media that we were trying to support be better at making money. So then we embarked upon a series of expansions of what we do to include the financial side of things. So we would train station directors, and we would train ad salespeople. And for that matter, we even went so far as in some countries to set up polling organizations. I don't know if you remember back in the good old days in the US, we had Nielsen and Gallup, and they would measure consumption of media, and it was the basis that their data was the basis for what the advertisers would pay, right? Because the advertisers want to pay to get their ad on a really popular show. So when we say a Super Bowl ad costs $1 million or $2 million or $5 million, why? Well, because there's lots of people watching. But how do we know? Well, somebody's got to be researching that, right? So we actually set up some of those research organizations in various countries, because without that, you can't accurately measure consumption, and without the accurate consumption measurements, you can't get advertisers to buy it. So we did a whole bunch of work on helping the business side of media get going. And then after the media that we helped were sort of, let's say, moderately journalistically capable and moderately financially capable, well, then they became threats to the governments, right? Because all governments want to control the information flow. And in less democratic places, they work really hard to do that. So then we realized we needed to put more effort into the enabling environment, the legal side of things. So then we would train lawyers and hire lawyers and deploy lawyers. And the lawyers would defend the media that were being attacked in courts with defamation suits and whatever else. But the lawyers also would go do policy advocacy. So they'd rock up to Parliament and they'd say, hey, senators and representatives, we need to talk, because the things that you're doing right now, they aren't really very good for democracy. You're all raw democracy. So let's put your money where your mouth is. Let's see some better laws. So I'll give a really simple example. Defamation, meaning libel and slander. We know that we don't want defamation, right? We know that we don't want one person going on the air and saying something patently and maliciously untrue about somebody else and destroying their reputation. So we do need laws against that. But those laws, they should have civil penalties, not criminal. Meaning, if you go and do something, definitely defamatory and you get convicted in a court, you should have to pay a fine of whatever the right amount is, enough to deter that kind of behavior, $10,000, $100,000, $1 million. But under no condition should somebody be put in jail for that. And the reason is because if you threaten a journalist with jail, if they say something, too far off the rails or whatever, then you've got a really serious chilling effect. Because all journalists now are going to be really cautious. And that's just going to take all of journalism and it's just going to squeeze it down to a little ball of really careful conservative speech. And we know we don't want that. We know that's not compatible with democracy. So one easy, simple thing to define as the correct, proper, progressive, enabling environment for journalism is that defamation needs to be a civil offense, not a criminal one. And in lots of countries, it's a criminal one. So we could rock up to Parliament and we could say, this needs to be changed. We need to decriminalize defamation. And, sometimes we'd be successful and sometimes not, or we'd maybe make it better than it was somehow. I'm giving a simple example of the policy advocacy work that we would do, but I could list another, dozen fields. Could have to do with frequency regulation, so the TV stations can get broadcasting frequencies. It could have to do with tax law. It can have to do with labor law. But anyway, where I'm going with that is that you see the progression here. This is a long answer to your question. The first work we did was about journalism, and then the next step was finance, sustainability of media, and then the next step was the legal enabling environment, and then the internet comes along. And so at that point, we're like, wow, well, we've kind of learned a whole bunch of different things, ways to do what we do, but it seems pretty clear that the internet is going to be a big thing, and most of the countries that we work in don't get it yet, and that's okay. So what we'd like to do is try to put in place an enabling environment for internet journalism now. We want to do it early. We want to do it before there are constituencies that would oppose us, right? Because if you try and change a law after somebody benefits from it being the way it is, then you're going to have strong opposition from whoever's benefiting. But the internet in its early days, nobody was benefiting because nobody had it, because there wasn't any.
Mm-hmm.
And so sort of the way the internet developed was first it was available in the US, and then it was available in other richer countries, and then it very gradually filtered out into less rich countries. So we could look at what was the discussions around cyber policy in the richer countries, and we could see what kinds of questions were eventually going to trickle down to the less rich countries. So let's take an example of net neutrality, which is the principle that says that an ISP should carry all content and shouldn't be charging more for some and less for others. And there are all sorts of details there, but the basic idea is that an ISP, an internet service provider, should just be a pipe. They should just be providing access to all content. That issue came up in the US, but it didn't come up in Kazakhstan yet, right? Because the internet just wasn't a big enough thing for anybody to care. So then we would hire a lawyer in Kazakhstan and we would train him up to be a cyber policy advocate. And then we would say, here's your job. Go out and get net neutrality enshrined in law in Kazakhstan. He'd call up representatives and senators and he'd say, this is what we should do. And they would say, we have no idea what you're talking about. Well, but that's part of what policy advocacy is about. So policy advocacy is a whole separate art, right? And it's what we call sometimes lobbying. And we say, well, lobbying, we don't like that. That's not part of democracy, is it? Well, it's kind of a rather inherent core tenet of democracy, which is that, as de Tocqueville described, Americans get together and they form groups. And those groups are interest groups. And those interest groups try to promote what their interest is. And in theory, this is sort of like democracy bubbling up from the bottom. And you've got all these interest groups and they're all fighting with each other. And the result is, on high, you adopt a policy, which is a compromise among the interests of all these interest groups. So the GIPI that you mentioned, Global Internet Policy Initiative, that was our attempt to sort of like try to build this idea of pro-cyber liberty policy advocacy into an aid project. And so we trained up and we hired and we deployed and we resourced and we financed those pro-cyber liberty policy advocate folks in dozens of countries. And I think it had a lot of good effect because we could see what was happening. By that time we had learned how all this stuff works, and we could see the internet coming down the pike, and we were able to get gazillions of good policies put in place that resulted in the internet being relatively more accessible and more free in places where it otherwise wouldn't have been. And an example would be Russia. So certainly Russia's in the news these days because of its invasion of Ukraine. But in the early days in Russia, you might have looked at Russia from abroad and said, dictatorship, right? Authoritarian. I bet their internet's really tightly controlled. Just like China, right? Because they're both dictatorships. They're both authoritarian. And you'd be totally wrong. Because until 6 weeks ago, the internet in Russia was pretty damn free. And one reason was because of the kind of work of the kinds of people that we had been resourcing to do the policy advocacy back in the day. And when you get a policy set in place early enough on, and then entire constituencies depend on that policy being that way, let's say a free internet or net neutrality or any of the other things that you might think, like, I don't know, are you familiar with CDA Section 230?
No, I'm not.
So 1996, U.S. government, starting to see the internet coming in, and says, I bet there's going to be lots of pornography there, child porn. That's terrible stuff. We need to control that. So the U.S. federal government, the legislature, right, Congress, Senate, they pass a law called the Communications Decency Act, which says that porn is not allowed, or child porn especially, and anybody who's caught purveying it is going to be in big, big trouble. A lot of that law, the CDL, was struck down because it was in violation of the U.S.'s First Amendment, right, which is basically pro-free speech. We have a heavy, heavy, heavy duty bias toward free speech, even if that means that we're giving up other rights like controlling child porn or something. But one little bit of that law didn't get struck down. And it has turned out to be one of the most important cornerstones of the modern internet, and it's called Section 230, and it's just one sentence or two. And it says basically the following. It says an intermediary online, in other words, a platform, which is not creating the content and not judging it and not making decisions about it, but which is merely a platform, which makes it possible for some people over here to share content on the platform so that people over here can consume it. That platform, they are not liable for the content that passes via their platform. This is called intermediary, meaning the platforms, intermediary liability indemnification. So this little tiny sentence said, if you're Facebook, you can't be sued for the fact that whoever said whatever, right? If you are informed, you Facebook are informed about some content on your platform which is illegal, then you should take it down. And if you don't, well, then you're liable, right? Because you knew that there was something illegal there. But as long as you sort of kept your eyes closed and just functioned as a platform, then you were not liable. That's indemnification. So that little tiny thing right there, that's ended up being the cornerstone of the modern internet, because you couldn't have Google, you couldn't have Facebook, you couldn't have Twitter, you couldn't have all of these things where content is going through without that intermediary liability indemnification. So we get, you get that built into other countries' legislation early on in the day, and there's nobody to fight against it because the internet barely exists. And then it becomes a cornerstone. And by the time that happens, once you have a Facebook and you have a Twitter and you have a Google, and somebody tries to get rid of CDL Section 230, well, how easy is that going to be, right? Because the entire ecosystem depends on that phrase being there.
Right. That kind of explains then, I guess, how YouTube was able to keep on a lot of the content they had early on. As I remember, the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, was coming after them hardcore. Oh, we're just the platform. We don't promote anyone's specific music on here.
Exactly right. Piracy obviously becomes a big issue. So you've got these issues, these constraints on free speech in the U.S. You've got piracy or intellectual property rights. You've got hate speech. You've got defamatory speech. And each one of these cases, eventually legislators would rock up to Facebook and Google and Twitter and say, hey, we realize that we gave you a blank check back there in 1996 with Section 230, but it's getting out of hand. Got to do something about that. So, normally what happens is these businesses, they would get together and they'd come up with some way to react to that to avert regulation. And they've been very effective at doing so, because clearly they have a lot of money and clearly they have a lot of smart people, and they can hire as many smart people as they need. And so they come up with ideas. So, Google, especially on YouTube, has come up with all sorts of automated notice and takedown processes that allow RIA, like you mentioned, or MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, to file, in a semi-automated format, a complaint with Google that would say, this such and such a thing on YouTube is violating our intellectual property rights, and then Google will somehow process that in a semi-automated way, which of course results in overreach, because, here's a funny example. These last couple of years in the U.S., we've had all sorts of curious goings on in terms of, let's say, Black Lives Matters demonstrations, and law enforcement agents everywhere seem to revel in having force and using it. I guess it's part of why you become a police person, so you can use that force. And so cops generally, I don't want to say generally, too often cops will use force where they shouldn't. And if you're a bystander and you video that and you put that up online, then that cop's going to get in trouble, right? So the cops are not that interested in that video appearing. So here's what some enterprising cops have done. They wade in with their truncheons to the demonstrators and they start beating people, but they are playing music as they do so. And the music that they're playing is copyrighted, right? Because all music is, more or less. And as a result, the audio, the music that's playing while they're beating people up, gets caught by the bystanders with their cell phones. And cell phones owners immediately post this, evidence of police brutality to YouTube, and YouTube's algorithms immediately catch that there's a violation of intellectual property right going on here because there's music there, Taylor Swift or whatever, and take that video down.
Real quick, has that actually happened?
Absolutely. Easy to find. Look it up. It's a tactic that's now demonstrated to work for police who want to engage in brutality.
they start playing copyrighted music of whichever artist, and then YouTube recognizes the video and removes it for copyright infringement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it becomes. I mean, these things are there. It's the space is an endless battleground, and I don't mean a physical one. I mean, once the cops start doing that, then the people who are doing the video are going to try to figure out how to edit their video so that audio is not there. But if you edit it, then you can be accused of producing a fake or something. So, it's back and forth and back and forth. And it's just tremendously fascinating to watch. But from a policy point of view, it's very interesting too, because our policymakers just can't keep up with this. They can't keep up with things that happened 5 years ago, let alone something, 6 months ago.
Exactly. So right now you're involved with Counterpart International, correct?
That was my last proper job. I'm not that job, that project that I was running there is no longer going, so I'm no longer a Counterpart employee. But that was my most recent job. That was a global donor-funded effort to increase the cybersecurity defense capabilities, and in general, just the cybersecurity safety of all the world's developing country independent media and rights defenders. So it's still, kind of part of what I've been doing for decades now. But in this case, instead of trying to train somebody to be a journalist, I'm trying to stop them from being hacked or compromised, and or their capabilities degraded. Because if you manage to brick a journalist's phone, you've basically cut off their arms, legs, and tongue because they can't do anything.
So this was more, was that endeavor more on the technical end as far as cybersecurity?
Mm-hmm. Yep, it was more technical. I mean, my trajectory was that first decade, the 90s, was all about these projects that were somehow strengthening local independent media. So it was the journalism and the financial sustainability and the legal side of things. And then as the internet came along, well, first of all, we kind of invented that field of local independent media development and support. But we didn't patent it. We didn't copyright it. We didn't own the idea. So other people started to copy it, and imitation being the sincerest form of flattery, eventually that means lots of people are going to be doing it. And that means maybe I don't need to do it anymore. I can go invent something new. So then started, and my first degree was in computer science. So I have a technical background maybe that's enables me to see things that other people maybe in the aid community generally wouldn't, because people in the aid community tend to be humanists or humanities majors, let's say, or linguists, or political scientists or whatever. So I could see the internet coming down the pike, and so I started spending more time on internet freedom. And so the aughts, I spent doing some media freedom and some internet freedom work, and then the tens I've been doing pretty much entirely internet freedom work. And it's got sort of like three legs to a stool. One is that cybersecurity work, or cyber policy work that we were talking about 15 minutes ago, the sort of like global internet policy initiative. So it's policy advocacy, trying to support a regulatory environment that's beneficial to freedom expression online. That's one. And then a second one is going to be freedom of access to content online. So that means somehow fighting cyber censorship, because governments, when the internet started to become real enough that it would affect the real world, people were getting content, and then as a result, they were, getting mad at rulers or whatever. Then countries would start blocking access to some content. And so we in the internet freedom community started trying to build the tools and operate the tools and deploy the tools that would enable netizens in developing countries to get access to content that governments are trying to block. So that problem is called cyber censorship, and the solution is cyber circumvention, which means helping people get around the block. And then the third leg in the internet freedom triad is cybersecurity. So that's trying to help people, and especially key people like independent journalists and rights activists, stay cyber safe so they don't get, caught or stopped or compromised in some way that results in an entire network getting taken down, or even operationalized in the wrong direction. So, I mean, you can imagine how if somebody has some rights activist reaches 1 million people, the government would love to use that channel. And if they can hack in and take over the activist's channel, and broadcast something that's in the government's interests, well, that you can see how that kind of impersonation also plays a role. So these three things: cyber policy, cyber circumvention, and cybersecurity. And again, it's sort of like I just happened to be in the right place at the right time because I was more technically literate than most. And nowadays I'm just, like anybody else. But in the early days, I could feel advanced. Now I'm old.
All right, for the future, do you plan on staying in this field of democracy promotion, journalist citizenship, and cybersecurity?
I still do it. My role has evolved over the years. So in the early years, I was kind of in the field, doing the work on the ground, and now I'm more of I guess I like to think of myself as an architect. So I see a donor making resources available to do these kinds of things, and then I try to think up ideas, and I try to find implementers, NGOs, who would be interested in those ideas, and then I try to help them write a proposal, and then if they get the money, then off they go, and I can go try and invent something new.
Any advice you would give to any young up-and-comers getting into the field?
Well, there are sort of two kinds of up-and-comers. There's the ones who want to get into the aid field, and my advice on that front is just go somewhere where the aid is needed. So, I don't know, a current aid darling is the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. And what it used to be called, Zaire. Anyway, the idea is if you just go there, right? Go to, what's the capital? Kinshasa. There's lots of aid going on there, right? And if you get in touch with an aid organization and you say, "Hi, I'm in Kansas City, and I'd like to come work with you," the aid organization is going to be kind of like, "You really don't know anything about what we do and how we do it." But if you are in Kinshasa and you call up a whole bunch of aid organizations, kind of like, me in 1990 writing a bunch of organizations and saying I speak Russian and saying, "Here I am, I'm happy to volunteer with you for the next month or two or three," and lots of people will call you up and deploy you, and then you'll find yourself becoming useful, and then they will write you into the next grant, or they will hire you, or you will definitely, at any rate, you'll have an into the next time a post becomes available, and posts become available all the time because the aid world is it's one of a lot of turnover because people go out and work in the field for a year or two and get burned out and leave, or they want to go somewhere else, or they meet somebody they want to marry and have kids. So there's always opportunities opening up. So you can go to Kinshasa. I mean, a decade ago I might have said Kabul. Maybe not a great place now, but on the other hand, there is still a lot of aid going on in Kabul because there's still a lot of humanitarian aid. Hotspot right now is going to be Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying you should go to Kiev, right? But there's a lot of aid going into Kiev, and there has been. I mean, the reason why Putin is invading is because Ukraine has been edging slowly but quite surely toward being a modern, democratic, open, rule of law type of place. And I'm not saying it was a great place before the invasion. It was just going in the right direction, and that's a real threat to Putin because if Ukraine makes it as a country, then Russians are going to realize that they could do it too, and then they'll kick Putin out. So that's really the core issue here. It has nothing to do with NATO and Russian security and Novorossiya. I mean, I'm telling you that as a professional Sovietologist, because remember, I lived in the Soviet Union. I speak Russian fluently. I got Greenpeace started in Ukraine in 1990. I've done everything in those countries, and this is not about NATO. That's just just an excuse. Anyway, where I was going with that is there was a lot of aid happening in Ukraine. There were a lot of Westerners working on that, and of course, the aid organizations don't want to pay expensive people; they want to pay cheap people. But if you're a young person, you're just out of college, and you want to get into the aid business, you can go to one of those places and say, "I want to help." And you will always find something to do. And if you want to do it so I said there are two ways. The second way, if you're not willing to go there or not comfortable with that, well, the tech side of things, there's the ferment in the tech world is just more and more and more and more every day. And you can go out and try and create the next Twitter or Square or Flip or Block or whatever, or you can try to apply your talents to some sort of freedom enhancing technology. And what that would be, well, if I could tell you exactly what you should do, then I would probably already be doing it. But there's an endless number of things that you could do, like on the cyber circumvention front, if you want to fight cyber censorship. There is lots of room, I think, for peer-to-peer circumvention. The major way that people circumvent now is connect up to a VPN. That basically works, right? Because if the Chinese have blocked all access to Facebook, but you connect up to a VPN in Slovenia, and through that VPN, you connect up to Facebook, well, the Chinese can't see that. They could try to block all access to VPNs, but that's a pretty hard task because VPNs pop up and then go away, and there are thousands upon thousands of VPN servers. And well, okay, so there's an interesting thought. What about if we create, like, the standard way to create a VPN is to have a server somewhere and run VPN server software. So that's kind of like takes a bit of skill and a few resources. But what if you could spin your VPN server up in the cloud? So now it takes less resources. That would be an advance. And yes, people are already doing that. But you still have to pay for your cloud services, or do you? Well, it turns out if you go look at a cloud service like Google Cloud or Azure, they'll usually provide you with something like 10 gigabytes, 100 gigabytes, maybe a terabyte of throughput in a free cloud account. Just like we all know that we can store, a gigabyte free in our Google Drive account, right? So how about if you go out and you invent a way for somebody in China or Iran to spin up a free cloud account, spin up a VPN server in that cloud account, create on the fly a VPN client for your mobile phone, which connects to that server that you just spun up just now, that you created out of nowhere. And you use it to circumvent for as long as you need until you run out of that free traffic. And then when you run out of that free traffic, kill that VPN server, kill that account, and create a new one. Is anybody doing that? Not yet, as far as I know. There's an idea.
Do you think we might see something like that in the future? More of that, I don't know if it's peer-to-peer is the proper word, but yeah, just smaller cloud networks.
None of what I just described was peer-to-peer. That's all classic client-server type things, right? Peer-to-peer offers more opportunity. I mean, it's a lot more complicated because does that mean that when I try to get something from Facebook, it has to go from me to you to somebody else to Facebook and then back? Because that's going to get really complicated in terms of it's going to slow things down a lot, right? I'm using everybody's bandwidth. Is everybody going to be cool with that? Well, we already have a prototype of that, and it's called Tor. Are you familiar with?
Tor browser.
Yeah. So Tor isn't exactly peer-to-peer, but it is in the sense of the entire Tor network operates on the basis of something like 6,000 servers. And when you spin up your Tor, when you start your Tor browser goes out and connects to one of those 6,000 servers, and then one of those, that one you connected to, connects to a second, and then the second one connects to a third, and then all of your traffic is routed through those three servers, bounced from server to server. So that's kind of peer-to-peer, right? Because those 6,000 servers, you don't know whose they are, and they don't know who you are. But that has problems in terms of throughput, because 6,000 servers isn't enough for the whole world. How would we get more? Well, that takes more bandwidth. And if some Tor server is an exit server, and you use Tor to do something illegal, then it's the exit server's IP address, which has been recorded. And maybe that's why you used Tor, but it's certainly going to be bad for that exit server. And so not everybody can run an exit server, or at least not yet, because if you did and the police come knocking, then you're going to shut down your Tor server, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we need so many Tor servers out there that this becomes normalized and nobody goes knocking on doors because of IP addresses, because everybody knows that all IP addresses are faked. Maybe, but we're not there yet. And until we get there, anybody running a micro server on their home PC is going to be subject to this kind of threat, let's say, and therefore they're probably not going to want to do it. So it's maybe not quite that easy, but maybe there are ways to get around that in terms of, like, what if you run it through some peer-to-peer servers until you run it through one of those quickly spun up transient servers in the cloud. I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to think about it. It just takes piecing together pieces that are all technically capable already. They just haven't been pieced together in that way yet.
So do you think over time it might, I don't want to say underground, but the internet might go a little more underground like this with these smaller, type of networks and servers? Or do you think people will always gravitate towards like the bigger platforms like we see?
Oh, I think in terms of what people want to do online, they're going to, the trend is clear that people want to access things that are well researched, well resourced, well supplied. And that means bigger platforms, right? I mean, anybody can create their own Twitter if they want. It's not that hard to create a Twitter, but it's taken Twitter quite a bit of work to get to the point where their user interface is the way it is, and it takes a whole bunch of back end work to distribute the load, and then you've got the network effect, right? So, what did we originally call it? Metcalfe's law, where the value of the network is proportional to the square of the number of users. Just think back to the first day you used, I don't know whether you ever did, but the first day you got a fax machine, if you were the only person with a fax machine, it wasn't very useful to you. And if 10 people had a fax machine, well, it was a little bit useful to you. But if 100 people had it, now it got really useful, right? Because usefulness would go up by the square. So anybody can go out and create a new messenger. I mean, my daughter wrote a new encrypted messenger for her college computer science class. That's not that hard. But if nobody is using it, then it's not very useful to you, right? So these network effects are pretty powerfully in favor of the I don't know whether the incumbents, but in favor of big players. Microservers, well, I do think it's certainly possible that as bandwidth keeps getting cheaper, then it becomes easier for peer-to-peer type stuff to work. But that would entail somehow the peer-to-peerness being built into the devices and the operating systems, especially more, which we haven't seen a lot of. But imagine if every Microsoft Windows were a peer client. Well, that would be pretty interesting.
Before we wrap up, Eric, is there anything you want to share, like anywhere where someone can look you up, any content that you want to share with the audience?
I suspect I'm pretty easy to find. You're welcome to, put up some text that makes it easy for people to find me, whether on one platform or another. I don't know, parting shot. I think online freedom is definitely up for grabs. So I would say my parting shot would be freedom, use it or lose it. In other words, if you don't care, if you don't make conscious choices like, I think I'm going to use Signal as a messenger to talk to mom instead of using WhatsApp because Signal isn't monetizing me. And I'm going to use it instead of Skype because Signal is end-to-end encrypted. Skype is not. And I think I'm going to use it instead of WeChat because WeChat is all recorded by the Chinese government. And I don't want that either. So I'm going to be intentional about this. And my gosh darn Gmail account keeps prompting me to turn on this additional security thing that I don't understand. And I don't want it. I don't need it because I'm just fine. Well, you're going to lose it because, the hacker's abilities are going up every day. And if you don't listen to these hints that suggest that you need to take a few steps to be more secure, you will get hacked. You will get lost. Your account will get lost. Your account will get used by somebody. You might not even know it, but it'll get used by somebody to try to scam all of your friends, and some of your friends will fall for it. And then eventually they're going to say, what the heck? And you're going to say, what? I didn't do anything. And your friend is going to say, no, I got this email from you that said you'd just been mugged in Madrid and you needed $100. And so I sent $100. And I'm going to say, no, it wasn't me. And your friend is going to be like, well, damn it, do you have two-factor authentication turned on in your account? And you're going to be like, what? So, freedom, security, pay attention, use it or lose it.
I like that. Use it or lose it for internet freedom. Eric, thank you very much for coming on, my man. I greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure. You know where to find me with more questions.
All right, signing off. Have a good one. Thank you.